The Battle of Midway became a huge turning point for the Allies in the Second World War. Without this victory, there may have been some unknown consequences. These unforeseen consequences could have led to a completely different world than what we know and call home today. As the world continues to grow, society is constantly being altered, leading to continuous change.
The Battle of Midway, involving the Imperial Japanese fleet and the United States Navy, took place near Midway Island between June 4th and June 7th, 1942. This conflict would become known as the biggest turning point in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War. Due to this battle, the United States Navy gained the ability to island hop, leading to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The debate over what might have happened if the Allies had not won and the diplomacy between Japan and America being altered is what caused the battle to become the most predominant and famous victory inside of the Pacific Theater.
This entire conflict had originated after the initial strike on Hawaii, formerly known as the bombing of Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941. This became a major setup for the battle to commence. Pearl Harbor became the initial engagement between the United States and Japan. These engagements became known as the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater held a series of battles such as the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, as well as many more engagements between the United States and Japan, creating the advantage for the United States to be able to island hop. Island hopping was a strategy used by the United States in the Pacific Theater, which gave them the ability to get closer to the Japanese homeland by building a series of air bases on captured islands, leading to a far more significant impact that would lead to the defeat of the Japanese Empire, who formally surrendered on August 14th of 1945 and signed the armistice on the 2nd of September 1945, nearly a year after Italy and almost 4 months after Nazi Germany.
The men in charge of these two forces were Isoroku Yamamoto for the Japanese and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz for the Americans. While these two oversaw all operations for their homeland countries' navies, there is one Japanese admiral in particular who gained superiority during this battle. This man's name was Chuichi Nagumo. While Yamamoto oversaw everything in the Japanese Navy, Nagumo was put in charge of the operations at Midway. Ironically, these two men did not get along well at all. This led to large amounts of confusion within the Japanese Navy, since they didn't see eye to eye with their plannings during the war. The fate of these two men would both be met within the time of the war, one of which being shot down while in a plane, the other using a pistol to kill himself with a bullet to his head.
While on the American side of things, Chester W. Nimitz was placed in the Pacific after the bombing of Pearl Harbor during the disorientation of the fleet's members and ships. Previously in the command at the time of Pearl Harbor was 4-star Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. Kimmel was replaced by Nimitz after Pearl Harbor because they needed someone they could trust who could put the Japanese at bay within the Pacific, as well as someone who could stay calm and work cooperatively under pressure with the sailors. There were many men in charge of breaking the Japanese code, but only one of the men was responsible for the U.S.'s victory at Midway. The name of that man was Joseph Rochefort. Joe Rochefort, who was fluent in Japanese, as well as having spent time in Japan, was part of a code-breaking team at Station Hypo in 1941 to help break the Japanese naval code JN-25. He was responsible for the United States Navy knowing when and where the Japanese were going to attack. At the start, he was the only one that thought that AF stood for the location of Midway. Although Joe had experience in his field as well as background with the Japanese, his superiors doubted him because he was a newcomer. After initially being rejected with his idea to protect Midway, America's current admiral of the Pacific Fleet at the time, Chester W. Nimitz, wanted proof whether or not AF was Midway. So they sent out an emergency message claiming that Midway was low on water. In return, Hypo intercepted a message from the Japanese claiming that AF was low on water. Rochefort had cracked the code, allowing for admirals in DC to plan accordingly and attack on the enemy fleet.
The attack would be an ambush against the Japanese, coordinated with an early arrival at Midway by the Americans. At the battle, the Imperial Japanese had 4 carriers: Hiryu, Akagi, Soryu, and the Kaga. The United States Navy could only produce 3 aircraft carriers: the USS Yorktown, Hornet, Enterprise, and Lexington. The Lexington, though, was lost a few weeks before Midway at the Battle of Coral Sea, making them outnumbered. After the 3-day-long battle, which predominantly took place involving aircraft carriers using their aircraft to go on reconnaissance missions, throughout the 3 days, the odds of the Americans succeeding seemed very slim. Many of their ships were being hit by Japanese bombers. Soon, the Americans would find a way to overcome the Japanese attacks, taking all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers, creating mass destruction amongst the fleet, putting them in a position that the Japanese Empire would be unable to overcome.
As a result, the Battle of Midway led to a multitude of consequences for both sides. The most recognized consequence is the turning point that it provided for the war. Things began to look up. Since it put Imperial Japanese powers at bay in the Pacific Theater, this had allowed for the Marines and the United States Army to push forward, soon leading to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These 2 bombings were the peak of World War II in the Pacific Theater. Developed by the United States and deemed ethical, nuclear warheads came into existence, also known as nukes. These weapons are still relevant and known today as highly effective weapons of war that many countries are able to get their hands on, which can lead to mass amounts of death, military as well as innocent civilians. Since nuclear warheads were proved to be such a deadly weapon, many countries wanted to have them, including Russia. This led to a larger debate known as the Cold War. The Cold War had disputes between the 2 countries known as the space race and the arms race. The arms race involved a mass military mobilization of both countries to see who could gain more power first. One of these military needs that the arms race included was the nuke. So without the victory at Midway, the Cold War may never have happened.
With multiple vital Japanese aircraft carriers being sunk and over 300 aircraft as well as their pilots being destroyed in the conflict, the Japanese were on their last leg. At this point, the Japanese were desperate. They could not afford to lose any more of their aircraft without hurting the Americans. So the Japanese developed a strategy known as the kamikaze. This strategy was where Japanese pilots would take their Zeros and dive bomb flying directly into the ships that they were aiming at. This would be almost guaranteed that the ship would sink. The Japanese would lose 1 pilot plane and 1 pilot, and the enemy would lose an entire ship with most of its crew.
Additionally, if the U.S. had lost, it would have left them with only 1 aircraft carrier, the USS Saratoga, also known as the twin sister of Lexington. They're known as sister ships because they're both Lexington-class aircraft carriers. Furthermore, a final impact of the battle created was the namesake of Midway. This led to the construction of a new aircraft carrier known as the USS Midway. Its hull and deck design would be modified 3 times throughout its life, which involves serving as a primary aircraft carrier in Vietnam. It now serves as a museum ship in San Diego, California.
All in all, the Battle of Midway became an extremely significant turning point for the Allies, creating mass destruction amongst the Japanese fleet, putting them at bay, allowing for the Marines and the U.S. Army to island hop towards Japan, building air bases along the way, creating a great lead way for the change in diplomatic relationship between the United States and Japan, as well as the debate between the unforeseen consequences of this life-changing battle.